It's my absolute pleasure today to introduce our guest, Marisa Renee Lee. Marisa is a called upon advocate, writer, and speaker on coping with grief. Her acclaimed debut, Grief is Love, unspools the story of her own grief journey and offers a compass to others navigating loss. She is a rabble-rouser of social healing, former managing director of My Brother's Keeper Alliance, co-founder of the digital platform Supportal, and founder of the Pink Agenda, a national organization dedicated to raising money for breast cancer care, research, and awareness. She is a regular contributor to Glamour, Vogue, MSNBC, and CNN. She is a graduate of Harvard and an avid home cook. She lives with her husband, Matt, their newborn son, Bennett, and their dog, Sadie. And we are so excited that she's here to talk with us today. So with that, I'm going to spotlight you and go ahead.
Yay! First of all, I just want to say a huge thank you to Kelly, who reached out and who I know did a bunch of work to organize this, and also Carrie. And I see we have a transcriber today named Allie, so thank you as well. This just feels like such a thoughtful and inclusive space. And I am really excited to be here. I'll be honest, and I shared this with Kelly when we first joined a few minutes ago. I hate these kinds of talks because I feel like it's too much about me. And I really want to spend as much time as possible engaging with all of you and, hopefully answering some questions and sharing the things that I've learned from, over 14 years of grieving the loss of my mom. So I am going to keep my comments and sort of my story as brief as possible so we can dive in and have a really substantive and supportive conversation together. So with that, I will jump right in. As Kelly shared, it's now over 2 months ago, I published a book called Grief is Love, Living with Loss, and am fortunate enough to share that it is now a national bestseller. I always feel really uncomfortable sharing that because if my book is doing well, it means lots of people are dealing with grief. And unfortunately, that is just the world we live in. And it's so much of why I wrote this book. So I want to start by just sharing some background on myself and how I came to write this book, why I wrote this book, and what I hope others can gain from Grief is Love. So I decided I was going to write Grief is Love in August of 2008. It was 6 months after my mom died, and I hit a wall. I had spent the previous 6 months feeling very confused and alone and disoriented and overwhelmed by these feelings of grief. I was so sad and lost and angry and scared. And instead of just allowing myself to have all of these complicated feelings that I had about the loss of my mother, I tried to downplay the situation. I basically gaslit my grief, for lack of a more technical term. And I tried to convince myself that there was something wrong with me. Why should I be so sad about something so ordinary? Like, at some point, we're all going to lose our parents. It's the normal course of things for children to have their parents die. I was technically an adult at the time. I had just turned 25 when my mom passed away. And so I felt like I should be fine. And I definitely wasn't. And so I spent all of this time feeling really ashamed and embarrassed and, beating myself up for how I was feeling. And then all of a sudden, it's 6 months out, and I don't know what shifted for me. But I found myself in this place where I was like, you know what? There isn't anything wrong with me. Like, where the problem sits is in how we talk about and treat grief and what we expect grief to look like, and all of these concepts around, moving on and getting over it and the stages and just all of these things. I was like, there has to be something wrong with the way that we're doing it. Not wrong with me. Like, I am okay. And so the day that I sat down and decided that, like, I was okay as a person. I wrote in my journal, I am going to write a book about grief, and it's not going to be just sad and depressing, and it will be a New York Times bestseller because, low expectations over here. And 14 years later, 2 out of those 3 sentiments have come true. And, for me, the journey from that moment where I'm pretty sure I was sitting in like an Equinox gym location in downtown Manhattan, squeezing in a few minutes of writing right after a workout, to the book being published in April 2022, 14 years later, a lot happened that pushed me to a place where I felt like I needed to physically get this book out of my body, and believing that people would really benefit from the things that I learned and my experiences with grief and loss. And so, to back up a bit, my mom was sick when I was growing up. She had multiple sclerosis. So I became a child that grew up rather quickly and was happy to care for her, happy to do what I could to help out my parents. But it was really hard. It was really challenging. And then my senior year in college, I'm 22 years old, a week away from graduating. My mom just keeps getting sick. Like, she was in and out of the hospital all the time. No one could figure out what was wrong with her. And she was someone, classic Black woman, never complained, never said anything negative about anything. And the fact that, every time I would call her from campus, she would be going to the hospital, in the hospital, going to the doctors, just, really having a lot of pain and discomfort. And the week that I was set to graduate, she called me one day and a doctor found lesions on her spine. And the doctor was a family friend, an orthopedic. And as soon as I heard lesions, I was like, oh, that has to be bad. And this was 2005. So way before Google was what it is now. And so I decided to go home. And I left school a couple of days before graduation and found myself in an oncologist's office in the Hudson Valley in upstate New York. And I watched this doctor go from examining my mom's like bones and skeletal system and joints to having her lay down on an examination table and actually touch her breasts. And in that moment, I knew we were in trouble. And she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. So I took a year off after graduation and just spent the year with my parents, helping them navigate this incredibly complicated diagnosis. And then I moved to New York City, split my time between a job on Wall Street and my parents' house, just helping them manage my mom's care. And because of the type of kid that I was, I'd been a caretaker since I was 13, 14 years old. I decided I was going to put myself in charge of everything connected to my mother's health, end of life, death, etc. And so I did all of this research and uncovered, the best medical trials for her to be in and the best diet for her to be on. And then when she was no longer undergoing chemotherapy, it was, okay, what does she need in order to live the best possible life in whatever time she has left? And, I read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's On Death and Dying to try and prepare myself for this loss. And then when it happened, and I was so lost and overwhelmed that I really didn't know what to do until that 6-month mark where I decided, frankly, and I hope this is okay, fuck this. Like, there's nothing wrong with me. I need to figure out how to do grief on my terms, because I know that I still miss my mom. I know that I'm still having a hard time processing this loss, but I'm not going to beat myself up for it anymore. And as soon as I made that shift, dealing with the grief became easier. And I would say for folks who got to know me after that point, a few months after I made that shift, I moved here to DC, where I live now. I started working in the Obama administration. I met a guy, he moved in, we got a dog, we got married. Like, I did all of the things. And throughout it, continued to, from time to time, experience feelings of grief and loss and just, longing for this woman who did such a good job raising me to be who I am in the world today. And then I thought I had reached a point where I was over it, where I had moved on, where I was okay, living life without my mother in the world. And then in 2019, my husband and I lost a much wanted pregnancy. And when that happened, of course, all I wanted was this woman who had been dead for over a decade. And in that moment, in dealing with both, grieving my mom and the lack of her comfort and care at a time when I really needed it, grieving the loss of the pregnancy and this hope that we had for ourselves and our family and our future that was just not coming to pass. And then also dealing with the physical consequences of a pregnancy loss, I was lost. I was really deeply grieving, and I didn't know what to do about it. And so I wrote. I wrote for myself. I wasn't writing for the sake of sharing our story or, frankly, helping somebody else. I wrote because I didn't know how else to get all of these feelings out of my body. And as I was writing, the world shut down because we lost our pregnancy in late 2019. And then we all know what happened in early 2020. So I suddenly found myself in this place of deep personal grief, like so much pain. I also found myself, unfortunately, still dealing with some health challenges related to my underlying health condition that led to infertility and also the pregnancy loss, in a world where we were all confined to our homes and everyone was grieving something, either the actual loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, the loss of normalcy, etc. And it was really hard. And then I realized as I was writing and, trying to work my way through all of this pain that I was experiencing personally, that I wasn't over it. And I asked myself, what does it even mean to get over it? Like, what would it mean for me to be over the fact that my mom died? What would it mean for me to move on? Like, am I just supposed to forget that I ever had this woman in my life? Am I supposed to just act like it's okay and totally normal to not have a mom here in the world when, other big life moments come up, like my wedding or, when I had the chance to bring my family in to meet President Obama? Like, am I not supposed to be thinking about her because I'm quote unquote over it? And I decided that all of those things, all of these concepts we have around grief and loss are bullshit. And I ended up writing an article that went somewhat viral in spring of 2020 for Mother's Day weekend about how I wasn't over the loss of my mom and I would never get over it. I was not going to move on. I was instead going to live my life on my terms, honoring my relationship with my mother and everything I gained from it, and continuing to hold love for her and knowing that, that love is sometimes painful. Like there is grief there, and that's just my life. Like I decided I'm throwing all of these other things out, and this is how I am going to approach my grief and my loss. And I don't care what anybody else thinks about it. And it turns out that message resonated with a lot of people. And within a couple of weeks, I had an agent, and 6 weeks after that, I had a book proposal, and 4 weeks after that, I signed a deal to write the book that came out in April. And for me, my whole thesis that you don't get over it when these things happen, transformational losses, the loss of someone who is foundational to your life. And I define foundational as someone who you count as yours, your mother, your sister, your child, your best friend, your spouse, etc. when one of those people dies, you don't get over it. Like that doesn't even make sense. You instead have to learn how to live with it. And what I wanted to do, because, as you know from my comments at the start here, I didn't want Grief is Love to just be about me and my story. Do I think there are things that I have experienced, good and bad, that people can learn from? Sure, absolutely. But as an avid reader, I feel like I learn the most when I feel like the source that I'm reading is trusted. And you have no reason to trust me. Like, I am not a therapist. I'm not a grief counselor. I'm just someone who's gone through it and tried to process it to the best of her abilities. So I wanted to partner with a researcher on Grief is Love, so that everything that's in the book and everything that I claim around grief and loss and how to live with a life-changing loss is actually grounded in the leading research and data on grief and bereavement. And so, my whole concept that you don't get over it, that there is no such thing, is actually, well, it's based on my humble opinion, but it is grounded in a theory called the continuing bonds theory, which essentially claims that the healthiest way to deal with grief and loss is to find a way to continue your bond with the other person, assuming you had a healthy, loving relationship with that person. And so that is the predominant research that sort of sits beneath everything in the book, both the funny, silly stories and the heavy, hard stories. And my hope is that through writing Grief is Love and having, more conversations like this with people, we are able to really normalize grief. We live in a country, and sort of the dominant culture in America is this idea that it is your job to be happy and positive and upbeat all the time. And the second that you aren't one of those things, it is your job to fix it, to pull yourself up by your emotional bootstraps. But that's not actually true. Like, if you are sad, if you are disappointed, if you are angry after dealing with a loss, or grieving something, or even as you go through moments of recovery, that is all normal. We're all born with innate emotions that include things like sadness and anger and fear. And so to live in a society that makes you think that there's something wrong with you when you experience those things, I don't want that. I don't want that for you. I don't want that for me. That's not the world that I want my kid to grow up in. So normalizing conversations about these challenges, these things that come up in life, I think is really important. So I'm really glad that we're having this conversation today. And just a couple of things that I focus on in the book that I want to mention before we turn to questions. So first of all, in the book, I completely redefine grief as the repeated experience of learning to live in the midst of a significant loss. Because for me, I found one of the things that caused me the most shame and pain after my mom died was this belief that I had that grief is something that shows up around the time that somebody dies, and right around the funeral. You think about all the TV shows and the movies that we've seen, somebody dies, everybody goes to the funeral, and then a week later everybody's all good, or 2 weeks later everybody's all good. And I was months later, years later, forever, and I'm still not all good sometimes because I miss my mom. And I want people to know that that's okay. And it's not just me that's saying that's okay. It's researchers and therapists and people who are way smarter than I am saying that that's okay. The other thing that I write about a lot, and I think is important in all of these conversations, whether about grief or loss or trauma or recovery or anything else, is the idea that it is incumbent on all of us to ensure that access to the things that people need to heal are not a privilege. as I dug into the research around grief and loss and healing, and I'm sure this won't be a surprise to many of you, but so many of the things that can help facilitate healing for people, a sense of physical and psychological safety, access to therapy and counseling and other types of mental health resources, access to physical health resources and various health services, paid time off from work, paid childcare, et cetera. Like, we know that those are things that are not equally distributed in our society. And so I hope that Grief is Love is something that people can use both as, a compass to guide them on their own unique journey through grief, and also as a bit of a call to action. We are living in the United States in a moment where in just over 2 years, over 1 million people have died from one thing. So there are millions of Americans walking around right now having to deal with and trying to navigate grief for the very first time. And it's really hard. And no one, and maybe we should make this, but right now, no one is wearing a t-shirt that says, hi, I'm Susan and I'm grieving. Like, no one's doing that. It's like, you don't know what people are carrying. And I'm sure many of you have felt this way on your own journeys. And so I just think it's really important that we all move with as much empathy and compassion as possible right now. And with that, I am going to stop talking and turn it over to you, Kelly, for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. I just wanted to hear more and more. Other people did as well, but they can read more in your book, of course. So let's get to the questions. We have some coming in. And also, if you haven't put yours in yet, please feel free to do so in the Q&A function in the webinar or in the comment section on Facebook. Okay, so it looks like the first one we have is kind of a little bit more of like a comment. This is very relatable to me. My mother was diagnosed with MS when I was 10. I was also her caretaker much of the time while my dad worked. I also grew up very quickly. She did pass away in 2007 after living in a nursing home for the last portion of her life. I do believe that chronic illness of a parent should be included on the ACEs score. I did go on to suffer with substance use disorder as an adult and contribute that childhood trauma as a factor. I have been in recovery for the past 17 years.
There was a lot that I had to process when I was writing this book, connected to my childhood. I think for my friends who grew up with me, for instance, like, they would say I had a great childhood. And like, I believe that too, to a certain extent. I had 2 active, engaged, loving, wonderful, supportive, fun parents. My house was the house that other people's kids ran away to because they knew they would be supported and loved and encouraged there. And it was fun. Like I definitely had a really good time in, childhood, middle school, high school, et cetera. But it was also really fucking hard. And there were things about that experience that I actually write about a bunch in the book, connected to resentment, for instance. I was never going to complain about my mom. I knew she did everything she could for me and my sister and my dad, even while being sick. And I know my dad did everything that he could to, take care of me and my sister and my mom. But it was just a lot. We didn't have a lot of money. There was just a lot of instability and financial insecurity and just fear that comes with having a parent who's healthy one day and then sick the next and never gets better, right? And I'm sure you get this as well around it. My mom was disabled. She went from being a working parent, and we went from being a 2-income household to a 1-income household. Like, there was a lot there that I frankly hadn't processed or dealt with. And there are still things that come up for me connected to my mom getting sick so young. When my mom got sick with MS, she was 37. which now that I'm 39, that is like so crazy to me. And I even had, a lot of anxiety crossing into my 37th birthday, thinking like, oh, is this going to be the year that I get sick too? So yes, I agree with you. And I clearly don't know enough about the ACEs score, but I do think that, it sounds like that is something that should definitely be included.
Yes, definitely. Our next question is, I think this is in reference to your book, I believe. Is this just about death, or can you read it as just a loss?
So I know a number of people who have picked up my book related to other losses and reached out. And even in my case, one of my best friends here, she texted me a couple weeks ago. And she read an early version of the book months ago, but she literally just texted me a few weeks ago and said, she just now realized after like reflecting on the book that it was really helpful for her to process it in the context of her parents' divorce that took place when she was maybe like 9 or 10 years old, because in her child's mind, one day her dad was there, and then the next day she and her mom were moving somewhere else to another house without him. So I think I think a lot of the lessons and the information can broadly apply to other losses. And I personally use the things that I've learned about grief that are in the book to apply to other losses and, big life changes that I've experienced as well. We are very, very fortunate, my husband and I. Last summer, we adopted an amazing, beautiful baby boy. And he's awesome. But there was grief that had to be processed when we decided we were no longer going to try to have biological children, for instance, So you're talking to someone, for better or worse, who sees grief everywhere, and tried to write a book that, while the book is definitely about death and the loss of my mom, it's also about the loss of my pregnancy. It's about, the loss of my identity, or at least what I thought my identity was as a woman, realizing through infertility and pregnancy loss that I won't ever have my own biological child. So I think it can apply more broadly. But if you're hesitant, do what I do with books that I don't know if I want to buy yet. Try a sample on Kindle or on the Kindle app and see what you think and go from there.
Definitely. I think that's a good piece of advice to do for sure. Okay, so our next question is, I think many of us beat ourselves up for feeling too much, especially in our grief. How can we become more accepting of what we're feeling and around our grief?
So I have genuinely an entire chapter on this, because this is something that I am guilty of. And even after writing this book and all of the things that I've gone through, I still do it to myself. Just ask my poor husband listening to me whine this weekend. I think that a big part of it is compassion that we apply to ourselves. It is so much easier to think about compassion for others than it is to think about it for ourselves. And so I just want to encourage everyone, literally everyone, to be more compassionate to themselves, because I think when you treat yourself the way that you treat your child, your best friend, your spouse, it suddenly makes life a lot easier. So many of the things that we say inside of our own heads to ourselves, so many of the judgments and the accusations and the comments, you would never say them out loud to somebody else. And so for me, sometimes I have to say well, what would your mom say? Or what would Allison say? She's my childhood best friend. In order to get better at how I treat myself. But it's taken, over 35 years, probably close to 40 years at this point, to get to a place where I really am intentional about self-love and self-compassion, because I do think it makes a big difference. And then the other thing that I will say is, because I am someone who struggles when people say things like what I just said, that's just all about feelings. So let me give you some facts too. Every therapist I have ever seen, and specifically the grief writer and researcher who I quote in Grief is Love, Dr. Dorothy Hollinger. She has an excellent book called The Anatomy of Grief that gets at like how grief attacks us physically. She says to name feelings, to actually acknowledge them, is the only thing that lessens their power over us. So every time we spend time, instead of naming and acknowledging and just being with and accepting our feelings, and we judge ourselves instead, like we cause ourselves more pain, we cause ourselves more harm, and it makes it harder to deal with those feelings. So if you don't want to just take my word for it and embrace compassion, the data speaks for itself. Like we need to get more comfortable just saying like, yeah, I am sad, I am angry, I am disappointed, I feel guilty, you know, whatever it is, just get it out, because that's the only way to move through it.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think it's largely due to the society we live in and those conditioned beliefs that we have, that we feel bad about grieving and that we don't want to voice those feelings, or that we feel bad about voicing those feelings.
Yeah.
It's because we don't collectively grieve publicly as a society.
Yeah.
And those
we
things.
don't create space for grief or really any other feelings that we deem as quote negative. Like we don't honor the fullness of the human experience in our, we'll just call it like modern white Western culture.
Yes, so very true. Okay, so our next question is, I had an older brother who was killed in a car crash when I was 19. My mom went from diagnosis to death in 3 months when I was 49. Can you comment on sudden and repeated trauma such as mine?
Oh, I mean, I just want to say I'm sorry, first of all. That is horrifying. My mom was also 49 when she died. And, you know, I don't know how old you were when that happened, but for me at the time, 49 seemed young, but it also seemed like old, or, you know, and now that I'm 39, I'm like, oh my God, like she was a baby. Like that's insane. So I will just say, you know, people ask me often if I am glad that I had the time that I had with my mom, you know, knowing that the clock was winding down, but having that ended up being about a 2.5 year period, all told, from diagnosis to death, or if I think it's easier to lose someone suddenly. And my answer is always, I don't think any of it is easy. I will just say that I want everyone to make sure that whatever care or treatment they are getting for their grief is specific to their grief. So whether it is something sudden like what you experienced, or for me, I could have used more counseling around anticipatory grief. Like I had horrible depression and anxiety before my mom died, and I mostly tried to ignore it because I was like, she's not dead yet, like I'm fine, which was wrong. So please don't anybody do that. Or if maybe your situation is complicated because your loved one was maybe not the best person, or, you know, caused you or somebody else pain or harm. I think it's really important to seek out like real certified counseling, psychological resources that support your particular grief experience, because it is different for everyone. And while I have seen friends lose people that suddenly, I haven't experienced it myself. So like, I don't want to advise you other than to say, one of the things that's been really helpful for me as I've been, you know, in and out of therapy throughout all of this grief is just working with someone who is an expert at like whatever my specific thing is. So I would say that's probably my main piece of advice. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, I think that's definitely helpful. And I never really thought of it that way. I think in my own grief, I've just been seeing my same therapist, but sometimes I wonder if like I should do more and find a parent loss group or something more specific to like what I experienced. So that makes sense to me.
Well, I will tell you, just to give a specific example from my own story. So it's so funny looking back now, I decided to find a new therapist when my husband and I were first going through fertility treatments. Not even first, we were like midway through fertility treatments. And I believed that we were going to become parents in 2019. So I actually started seeing a new therapist in early 2019, late 2018, something like that, to like get ready to become a mom without my mom, because that was the thing that I needed, that I thought I needed most at that time. Of course, it all ended up going sideways, and thankfully she does have expertise in grief and loss, and it worked out. But I kind of hit a wall in summer of 2021. You know, I was working on the book. It was almost done. Writing this book was deeply painful for me personally. Has it ultimately been positive? Yes, but it was just really hard, you know, like day after day, sitting with my own grief, uncovering things that I never processed or didn't know about myself, and then trying to repackage those things so that they're useful to someone else. Like it was mostly me on the floor of my office, like crying and like writing the book on my iPhone half the time. I was a mess. And I kept having like this physical sensation of like heaviness, and I was having trouble sleeping, and you know, some other like physical things. And I am someone who very much processes my emotions physically. You know, like if I'm nervous, I get a stomach ache. If I am like feeling depressed, I'll have a headache. You know, like I know that about myself. And so as much as I love my therapist, I actually sought out a different counselor and did a couple of sessions of hypnotherapy to like try and get at what I was feeling and like why it was showing up in my body the way that it was. And that's actually how I figured out that I was really angry, that I'd been holding on to all of this anger for over a decade toward my wonderful, lovely dead mother. And it was only through that, like hypnotherapy, like through those sessions, that I was able to work through that. And like, it was incredibly helpful. And I don't know that I could have gotten there with my regular therapist, who I still see from time to time, who's amazing. But I'm all about seeking out whatever it is you specifically feel like you need right now to help you through whatever it is you're going through.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And there's so many different healing modalities. So it's wonderful that we try to explore what is available to us. So awesome. So our next question is, can you speak to the complex feelings of grief with losing a mom who was so dear, but also complicit in keeping family secrets around abuse in the family?
Oh gosh. You guys are really coming at me with these questions today, Lord. That is a really tough one. And it honestly isn't something that I have encountered personally. And one thing, and I just, you know, I'm all about being honest and upfront with people. Like one thing that you won't find in grief is love, because like I don't feel capable of speaking to it, is like, how do you deal with grief when the relationship with the person you lost is complicated? And when I say complicated, I mostly mean it's complicated because of painful things that they've done to you or others. I have watched friends and other family members try to navigate that, and it's deeply challenging, and it's really layered. And I think the most important thing that you could do for yourself, so it's twofold. One, I'm all about encouraging people to access therapy and counseling as a part of their grief journey. You know, buy my book, read my book, but also I really believe in getting, you know, the kind of help you would get if you broke your leg. You know, like you would go to the doctor, you would get a cast, you would get crutches. Like I really am all about encouraging people to get the proper mental health support for dealing with these things, because it makes a huge difference. And frankly, I am speaking from a place of not having great therapy after my mom died. And I think that great therapy really can just be a game changer. The other thing that I will say is I think it's important to give ourselves room to hold multiple truths at the same time. I don't know you, I don't know about the relationship with your mom, but the way that you frame the question, my gut instinct is that, your mom's someone who you loved, who loved you, who supported you, but who also unfortunately was complicit in things that were harmful. And I think it's important to give ourselves permission to honor both pieces. It is okay for you to hold love and compassion and longing in your heart for a person who was deeply flawed. And, assuming they hurt someone else and these secrets were not related to you, but things that of, it's also okay for you to be honest about the fact that they were deeply flawed and respect both your opinions and feelings and maybe the opinions and feelings of others who don't have the same fondness for her. I think because, just getting back to the culture piece again, because we exist in a society that is so big on, everything being black and white, and good and bad, or, you're happy or you're sad, and one thing is good and one thing that because of that, I think it's really hard for us to wrap our minds around the truth, which is that human beings are deeply complex and we're all flawed and we all have challenges, and not everyone has the same relationship with the same person. There are just so many things that are true, and I don't think we give ourselves enough room to tell the full truth about someone or even about our own feelings and emotions.
That just resonated so much with myself and my story and my grief journey as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, good.
I appreciate it. And with that, I actually had a question from me, which is I found that grief has made me feel very lonely and isolated at times. And I think this is somewhat due to how differently I've grieved than my family members for this particular loss, which was my father. So how can we stop comparing our grief to others and feel less isolated?
So a couple of things. First of all, thank you for asking the question. Grief is isolating. I think for me personally, anytime I have gone through something that is hard in a life-changing kind of way, I feel isolated. I feel like no one else could possibly fully understand what I'm going through or how challenging it is or how much it hurts, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing is, some of that is true because we're all different and everything lands differently with each of us. But I think to make grief less isolating, I think it's a few things. First, figure out where you can build a community that works for you, whether it's online or in person. And frankly, it doesn't necessarily have to be a grief community unless that is what you're seeking. It could be as simple as, in my case, my mom's birthday and the anniversary of her death are 10 days apart in February. So my roommates from college have taken to calling it "fuck you February." And there are, and I don't even know the details behind it, but there are plans around checking in and, sending a card or stopping by our house because some of them live locally, things like that. So I have found a lot of support from people who, some of them have lost parents, some of them have never lost anyone significant, but they decided they were going to show up and made a plan for how to do it. I do think, though, there is something different and special about finding other people who you can identify with who also gone through a loss. I don't know, there are people who I've become friends with on Instagram who've also lost parents. And like, those are the people who are going to think to text you, not only on the birthday and the anniversary of your person, but when something great happens, like your book comes out and they're like, what's going on? And you're like, are you okay? How are you holding up? Like, how does it feel to be constantly talking about grief all the time? Like they're the people who think about things differently because they've gone through it. And then in terms of comparisons, I think it's really important for all of us to remember that your grief, you said it was your father. So like your grief is different from whatever your mother is experiencing, whatever any siblings are experiencing, like, because your relationship with this person was different. So like, I don't grieve the loss of my mother the same way that my father does, or the same way that my sister does. Like, I have my own separate and unique perspective and process, and like, that is okay. Like, truly, it is all okay. I think we need to make sure that we don't let feelings of isolation keep us from doing what we need to do to heal. Like, you never want these feelings of like, oh, we're not doing it the same, to lead you to a place of self-judgment and shame, and then more isolation. And then instead of accessing the things like therapy that can help you move through and like live with your loss, we access other things that like don't actually help, but maybe serve as a quick fix. So I think that's a really important thing for folks to think about.
Definitely. I think it was more of a shock and a surprise to me when I lost my dad. And I just assumed that like my mother and my sister, we would all be like crying together and hugging each other and like doing all these things on his birthday and his death anniversary. And I was shocked and surprised and disappointed because I had these expectations of that's how it's going to be, because they're going to feel the same as me.
Yeah.
And it's not like that. And I have to remind myself that it's okay. Like, I can still do those things for him, and I do. But those are the times when I feel a little bit like lonely and isolated, because I felt like these are the people who can understand the most out of anybody else. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have the same experience as you. And like you said, they definitely had different relationships with him. So it does make sense, but it's been hard to like accept that for sure.
It's hard. And I will say, for me, I struggled the most with my father. I like didn't want to be around him after my mom died because it just felt too awkward and uncomfortable. And there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, he's a pain in the ass, but like, he's a wonderful human being, great father, grandfather, etc. But I was just like, oh, I can't do it. So in 14 years, I've maybe spent like 3 or 4 anniversaries with him, because like in the beginning I was just like, no, like I ran away to be by myself to the beach in Miami at the 1-year anniversary of my mom's death. Like, I didn't want to be around anybody. So I think with the family stuff, what I have found is really important is boundaries. Like being clear about what you want and what you need, and honoring that, even if it makes other people feel uncomfortable. Like, Kelly has a right to have a birthday party for dad. And if you don't want to come, you don't have to come. Like, she'll invite other people. Like, it's cool. But yeah, I think being really clear and intentional and communicative when it comes to boundaries when you're grieving in the context of family.
Yes, for sure. That's super helpful. So thank you. I appreciate it.
And I apologize. I hear a vacuum cleaner happening outside of my office. I hope y'all can't hear it.
I can like barely hear it. So hopefully
okay.
It's like a faint background noise.
Okay, good.
So our next question is coming in through Facebook. And this person says, I'm 62 and my mother passed from pancreatic cancer at 84 just a year ago. I find my feelings being dismissed or downsized even by my own mind, by reasoning that she was older and I am old, but I am not old and she was not that old. I am her child and I still need her and miss her. Have you spoken with women of older ages finding little validation for their feelings?
Yes, absolutely. I actually, I text pretty frequently a guy I was friends with when I was a kid. And I actually stayed close with his mother through the years. Like, she was one of the moms in my life who helped support me and like, would check on me when my mom was dying and then after she died. And she lost her mom maybe like 2 to 3 years ago, because it was like right before the pandemic. And yeah, she's experienced the same, like just a lot of frustration, like kind of the idea that I tried to embrace right after my mom died, like, oh, it's a parent, you're an adult, you're fine, it's no big deal. But I don't know why we have to treat people like that. Like just because you are a certain age or just because your mother was a certain age, that doesn't mean that you can't still be sad, that like you're not entitled to your grief. Every single person who dies, this is something that President Biden will often say, like it is an individual, deeply personal tragedy for someone. And that is normal. Like I just need to somehow recreate our society so that we normalize these experiences. Like when you look at other cultures, like, so the Jewish culture, for instance, there's a mourner's prayer, there's a candle that gets lit every year on the anniversary. I forget how to say the word in Hebrew. Like there are these rituals, and I'm sure the same exists for like a lot of Native American cultures, like other cultures throughout the world. Like we just are so bad at it. And I think a lot of it, frankly, probably comes down to 2 things. And I write about this in Grief is Love: white supremacy and capitalism. Like no one, unless they are a truly terrible human being, is monetizing your grief. Like there's no value attached to it in a society that is obsessed with capitalism and results and returns and things of that nature. And so of course, people don't want to deal with it because there's nothing for them to be gained from dealing with it in a culture that worships productivity and making money. And so we all, I think, have to be a part of building a culture that pushes for something different. Like it doesn't cost any of us anything to be more compassionate or to have more empathy or to simply give people the space to grieve free from judgment. Like it's not that hard. We just don't do it. And I'm hopeful that this book can be a part of changing that conversation and like pushing people to behave and view these types of conversations and things differently.
Yes, I totally agree with everything that you just said. And I know President Biden is someone who knows grief very intimately.
Yes.
More than many of us. So yes, I appreciate everything that you said in that context. Just makes so much sense. And it's also why it's so hard to change our current culture and society. But I think we're all doing it in our little ways, you yes. with your book and us with just speaking about grief in our community here at She Recovers, which is awesome. And I hope we continue to do more and more. So I think our last question is just going to be, can you speak to your experience as a Black woman and how that's affected your grief experience?
What makes you think being Black and female would impact my life at all? Kidding, obviously. Yeah, so there is a lot of this in the book. I didn't think a lot about race or gender and the impact on grief until I lost my pregnancy. And suddenly I had all of these people complimenting me for being vulnerable just because I told the truth about what happened. And it always, and even now, like my palms start to sweat thinking about it, like it always made me feel kind of icky. And it took me a minute to unpack that. And then I realized that I didn't want like praise or compliments. I didn't really think I deserved them because by the time I lost our pregnancy, I felt like I was in a place in life where like, I just didn't give a fuck what anybody thought about what I had to say about my feelings, about my grief, about this pregnancy loss, about infertility, IVF, etc. And I realized that I could be that way because I was in a place of privilege. Like, yes, I'm still a Black woman in America with all of the complications and challenges and racism that comes with that. But I have created a world where I feel like I'm about as safe as a Black woman in America can be who's not named Beyonce, right? And so I could say whatever I wanted. I could embrace grief differently this time around because I didn't have to care as much. Like, I felt safe. And so for me, the whole thing with this book is about, like, how do we make sure that we create the kind of conditions in a world where no matter how Black you are, or gay, or trans, or poor, or whatever, that you have the safety and the support that you deserve simply as a human being to grieve and to heal. And so, do I think there are a myriad of things that make grieving while Black harder, just like everything else in life? Yes. And I hope that when people who aren't Black read Grief is Love, they have a better understanding for the burden that comes with Black skin and the ways in which we have to carry that burden around no matter what it is we're dealing with. So yeah, it has been really hard, in particular, to let go of the strong Black woman narrative and redefine strength on my own terms. Like, strength isn't me keeping my mouth shut and never sharing my feelings about this stuff. Like, strength for me is telling the truth about how I'm feeling and accessing whatever it is I need to be okay, no matter what I'm dealing with in life. So thank you. I didn't see the name of who asked the question, but thank you for asking the question. It was great.
Of course, yes. And thank you that was a beautiful note to end on, and just another amazing reason to get this book if you haven't already. And you can pick it up at your local Target. It's called Grief is Love. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you so much, Marisa, for your time and your heart and your experience, and for writing this book. Thank you to all who make this series possible. And most importantly, thank you to all of our viewers for showing up today, holding space, and bringing forward your questions. We truly are stronger together. Next Monday, we will have Margaret Swift Thompson, who will be talking about family systems and addiction. Please join us. To learn more about Mental Health Monday and all of our upcoming sessions, please visit sherecovers.org/Mental Health Mondays. For more information about She Recovers Foundation and all of our recovery-focused programs, resources, and touch points, please visit sherecovers.org.